So around this time, our boy General Gates comes back into the picture because, like you mentioned earlier, General Schuyler, the commander of the Northern Army, he's being a little bit soft. He's being pessimistic. He's whining. He's complaining. He's not very hopeful and optimistic about their outlooks. And Congress and Washington, they're getting worried, and they're like, we can't have a guy like this in command of an army. We need a strong leader. So Schuyler gets the boot. Gates takes command. So this kind of sets the stage for, the two battles of Saratoga. So now Gates is in charge. Walk me through the situation to the buildup of Freeman's Farm, which is the first battle of Saratoga.
So Gates takes over, as you mentioned, and he starts moving the army had Schuyler had pulled the army all the way back to just north of really just north of Albany. So he had pulled them really far back. Um, by this time, Washington had sent forward a lot of reinforcements, particularly reinforcements in senior leaders. He felt after the loss of Ticonderoga that the thing that Schuyler really needed was kind of some steel in the backbone. So he sends up some really good leaders, and he also knows Schuyler isn't very good with the militia. The militia doesn't like Schuyler, so that's a problem. So he's gonna send up leaders who are who are good with militia. So that's why he sends Benedict Arnold up there. Um, Arguably his most dynamic, aggressive combat commander. He sends him up there. This is before Gates even is in command. He sends Benjamin Lincoln up there, who's really good with militia, and he sends several other people up there as well. And then, of course, he'll end up sending Colonel Daniel Morgan and his riflemen. So the way I look at those guys is almost think of those guys as Rangers or American
Yeah,
Rangers or Special Forces or SEAL Team 6.
for
The
sure.
kind of unit that everybody wants, but there's only one of them. So you got to be careful about how you use those guys. And it shows out Washington to me. Um, Washington is the unsung hero of this entire campaign. It shows that Washington, he's willing to give up his most elite force to go up and help those guys up in the north when he could have obviously used them in his campaign against Howe. But at any rate, all that is happening, and when Gates takes over, he starts moving the army north. And what he's going to look for is some good defensible ground on the west side of the river, because he knows that if Burgoyne is going to continue to come south, he's going to have to cross over to the west side because that's the only place where there's a road net that heads south. So he moves north and he sends basically a reconnaissance party forward to find the best defensible terrain. And included in that party is Colonel Kosciuszko again. And Kosciuszko finds this wonderful piece of high ground that dominates not only the river, the Hudson River, but also the road to Albany, the main road to Albany. And that's a place called Bemis Heights. And so he picks that terrain. Gates approves it, and Kosciuszko will basically lay out the defensive positions, and the Americans will start digging in on Bemis Heights. Burgoyne, after the Battle of Bennington, now basically has all the information he needs to make an informed decision on do I continue to push ahead, or do I focus on saving the army at this point? And instead, the choice he makes is I'm going to continue to push ahead. He'll argue later that his orders gave him no alternative. He
Hmm.
had to push ahead, which is actually wrong because his orders there was a clause in his orders that said at all times use your discretion. So at any rate, he pushes forward. He makes that fateful decision, probably the most important decision he's going to make in the entire campaign. They cross the river to the west side. At that point, he's basically cut his lines of communications, and he moves south and he runs in the Americans. By this time, all of his Indians, his Native Americans who have supported him with the army, have deserted because after Bennington, they saw the writing on the wall that Burgoyne apparently couldn't
Yeah.
read, and they all desert. And so he had used the Native Americans as basically as his cavalry,
Hmm.
for scouting and for screening his army. Well, those guys are gone now. And so now the Americans know exactly where he is, exactly where he's moving. They don't have to worry about the Indians running into Native Americans in the woods anymore because his are gone. Burgoyne's are gone. And so the Americans spot all of his movements. They know exactly where he is. And Burgoyne decides that he's going to defeat these Americans by. Should we talk about Freeman's Farm at this point?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. So Burgoyne comes up with a plan. Remember, he still thinks he can beat these Americans. He's already beaten them before. He's still pretty confident, even though he's lost. He's had these losses, these setbacks. So he's going to conduct this three-pronged attack, where these three columns will advance. And when one of these columns run into the Americans, they'll basically fix the Americans, and the other columns will then pile on, and then he'll be able to defeat them. But what happens is when the Americans see these columns coming, Gates will send Colonel Morgan and his riflemen, along with his light infantry support under Major Dearborn. They will attack the center British column, start inflicting heavy casualties on this British column. The British will, the two other columns will march to the aid of the center column. The Americans will send more regiments and brigades out to fight this fight out of the fortifications. Burgoyne will send primarily the left wing of his army out to fight this fight at Freeman's Farm under Benedict Arnold. Arnold will not get too involved in this fight himself. He'll basically just send forces into the fight, but he won't get too involved in the Freeman's Farm fight. But the Americans, even though the Americans will ultimately fall back, they stop Burgoyne's attack cold because they inflict heavy casualties on Burgoyne. And even though Burgoyne is able to say he won the battle because he held on to the battlefield, the Americans will inflict 3 times the casualties that they'll suffer on Burgoyne. And of course, these are casualties that Burgoyne cannot,
Yeah.
deal with. So Burgoyne, again, it's decision time. Do I fall back and save the army, or do I continue to push on to Albany? And right around this time that he's trying to make this decision, sorry, I need to put my phone on silent. I apologize for that. Around the time he decides, or he's trying to make this decision, he's thrown a lifeline by General Clinton. Now, General Clinton, Henry Clinton, he's back in New York. He is Howe's second in command. He's been left there while Howe conducts the Philadelphia campaign with a small force. And when Howe leaves for Philadelphia, he gives Clinton this sort of vague, well, if you find you have the opportunity to help Burgoyne, see what you can do. So Clinton had sent a message to Burgoyne. All the reports that Clinton had received from Burgoyne said, hey, everything's going swimmingly. I took Ticonderoga. I'm chasing the Americans. Everything's going great. So Clinton thinks everything's fine. But then he gets this report from Burgoyne saying, holy crap, I'm in big, big trouble. I need you to come and rescue me. And so Clinton goes, whoa, okay, that's a big change. Okay, well, I'll see what I can do. Clinton puts together this small force because he doesn't have much available. He puts together a small force, and he tries to come up the river to help Burgoyne, or at least to take some pressure off Burgoyne. Clinton had never had any illusion that he'd be able to come up and actually fight a big pitched battle against Gates and save Burgoyne. But he's hoping that maybe he can draw some of those forces away from Burgoyne. So He goes up the river. He quickly seizes the American forts at Fort Montgomery and Fort Clinton. He'll continue up the river, but the closest he gets is about 50 miles south of Albany, because he starts running into all Americans are everywhere now. Of course, the militia is everywhere; they're all coming out, and Clinton will turn back and go back to New York. Unfortunately for Burgoyne, he never gets, the other messengers that Clinton will send to Burgoyne never make it through the American lines. So Burgoyne never gets the word that Clinton has had to turn back. So he sits there and he has to cut rations twice. And in the meantime, all sorts of the American militia is just pouring in now to Bemis Heights. By the time you get to the early October, now there's about 11,000 Americans instead of 6,000 Americans. And Burgoyne is now desperate. Some of his generals beg him to retreat back to Ticonderoga, but Burgoyne decides that he's going to conduct basically a reconnaissance in force to see if maybe, number one, if he can forage for some food, because his animals are dying now too, as well as his men starting to starve. So this reconnaissance in force is going to either to do two things. Number one, forage for food. That's the most important thing. Number two, see if maybe there's a way that they can get around the Americans, and then try to do that the next day. So on the 7th of October, he sends this reconnaissance force out. He basically personally leads this reconnaissance force out, this 2,000-man reconnaissance force. The Americans immediately spot this movement, and of course, they're going to respond. Gates, like he did with the first battle, he'll send Morgan out along with their infantry support. And they immediately start inflicting heavy casualties on this British reconnaissance force. And then Gates will also send another brigade out. And pretty soon they're crushing this reconnaissance force. Burgoyne orders a retreat. The retreat is totally disorganized. There's leaders are falling left and right. In fact, Simon Fraser, his best combat commander, is mortally wounded during this retreat. And pretty soon they fall back into their British fortifications, but the Americans are right on their heels. Arnold asks Gates for more reinforcements because he thinks he can break through the British fortifications. Arnold is ultimately able to do that, although he is seriously wounded himself. But the Americans seize the far right of the British flank, and now the Americans are there in force on Burgoyne's flank, and he has no choice but the next day to order a retreat, finally.
It's crazy to see how quickly things went from, overconfident and we're going to breeze through to absolute disaster. You talk in the book about grip, commanders having grip. Would you say that Burgoyne didn't necessarily have the grip that was required here?
Yeah, I think clearly he didn't. Grip is the way I define grip is a commander who not only has command of all the stuff a commander has to know. What is my logistical situation? Where are all my units? What is the situation with each one of my units? What are the ones I can count on? All those commander business stuff. But also, it's a commander with grip has a step beyond that. Somebody with some intuition, somebody who's able to look at a battlefield and be able to make decisions even without perfect information. No, Burgoyne is definitely not that guy, for sure. I think Washington had grip. Unfortunately, sometimes the tools he was using could not execute what he wanted
Yeah.
them to do. I think he had grip. People like Patton had grip.
Oh, yeah.
U.S. Grant had grip. Napoleon obviously had grip. Rommel had grip. These guys who had this innate, intuition. Um, Definitely, Burgoyne did not have it.
Yeah. So ultimately, he's just, the complete victory. He was crushed completely and he's forced to surrender. So, what exactly does the surrender of an army look like? I mean, these are thousands of men that are now captured. Where do they go? What's the process like for this?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it definitely adds a big headache to the winning commander. I mean,
Yeah.
what do you do with these guys now? You got to feed them. You've got to take care of them, and you have to secure them because you don't. They're a security risk, obviously. So, as what maybe Burgoyne lacked in generalship, he made up for in negotiating skills because he negotiated a very favorable terms for his army's surrender. And the terms were basically, okay, we will agree to surrender, but you have to let us go back to England. We'll promise never to fight in America again. We'll give our parole, but we'll go back to England. And so Gates agreed to those terms. And the reason he agreed to them, I believe, is he was worried about Clinton coming up the river behind him. And so he just wanted to end it. The sooner I can get Burgoyne's surrender, I'll do it. So, as terms of this surrender document, which was called the Saratoga Convention, the British Army would be marched to Boston, and once they got to Boston, they would be embarked on British ships and taken back to England, promising never to serve in America again. But of course, what that all that meant was the British would just, give them other missions and send forces in Britain to replace them. So, an army is fungible, just like money is fungible.
Yep.
And so it's um, really favorable terms because in this way they wouldn't lose an entire army. So they marched to Boston, and when Washington and Congress gets word of the surrender, of course they're thrilled. They're very thrilled. In fact, um, this is the origin of the first American Thanksgiving. Is the surrender of the British at Saratoga? Washington declares a day of Thanksgiving because of that, or Washington Congress, I forget which one. Um, but they're not happy about the surrender terms at all.
Yeah.
So Washington tells the American commander at Boston, who is responsible for taking care of these British soldiers, he basically tells them, look, they have to agree, they have to follow every single, and there were like 12 provisions on the surrender document. You make sure that they follow everything to the letter, and if they don't, we're not sending them home. And so, so one of the provisions was something along the lines of, the surrendered units will give up their colors and all of their, muskets and all this stuff. Well, there were a couple of the British regiments that hid their colors. They didn't want to give up their colors. And so the Americans said, well, you haven't lived up to this surrender document, so you're not going home. And so basically they said, you violated the surrender document that you signed. So you're still our prisoners, but you're not going home. And so basically, these British soldiers never got home. And so they were called from that point on the Convention Army.
Hmm.
And so the Americans will then spend the rest of the war marching these guys to and fro across America, keeping them away from any other British armies who would, we thought would
Yeah.
try to rescue these guys.
Right.
So we marched them to Charlottesville, Virginia. We marched them to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So they went from Boston to Charlottesville to Lancaster. I mean, just back and forth and back and forth.
What a
I
headache.
remember when I was a young second lieutenant, driving to my first post at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and passing these roadside markers saying the Convention Army passed through here, and I had no idea what they were talking about, and it was Burgoyne's army basically.
Wow.
That were so what ends up happening is a lot of these guys, well, obviously, some of them died of disease and things as prisoners of war. But many of them, many Brits and Germans decided that they liked what they saw being marched around America, and they stayed in America and became American citizens after the war. Um, a lot of the officers were exchanged. Burgoyne was allowed to go home. He complained about ill health, so he was allowed to go home in the spring of '78. Where once he got home, he was obviously had to answer lots of
Yeah,
questions
he got grilled.
when he got home. Yeah. Other officers were exchanged for American prisoners and so forth. But again, a lot of those guys ended up being American citizens after the war.
That's so ironic because, these guys are fighting the Americans because Americans are fighting for their independence, and these guys are trying to crush that rebellion, and then they end up, you know, starting a life and living in this newly founded United States, this independent free nation. That's pretty ironic conclusion to that story.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's sort of sad too because, like I said, there were a lot of them died of disease and things like that,
And I'm
and
sure
they.
a lot of them probably had to leave family behind in England.
Oh yeah, 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 absolutely.
Yeah, definitely sad. Looking back on the Saratoga campaign, I know this is a broad question, but where did American commanders go right where British commanders went wrong?
Well,
I If you could sort of sum it up.
yeah, I mean, with something like this, I almost go back to um, the great British historian Michael Howard, um, who wrote at one point that look, all you got to do is you got to get it better than the other guy. You got to be a little bit better than the other guy. And in this campaign, from Ticonderoga on, we got it better than the other guy. And sometimes it was just a little bit better. Sometimes it was a lot better. But we got it a little bit better. And I think a lot of that had to do with, again, I think our senior level leadership was better, which is almost counterintuitive because you would think that the
Yeah,
professional military officer would be better,
right.
but our senior officers just made better decisions along the way. Um, and I think also, we knew the terrain, we understood the geography. They didn't. They had this this totally incorrect notion of what it would take to campaign in America. Uh, and,
Naivete
I, and
almost.
I think that was one of those fundamental errors that they made. And it was the faulty strategy. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really hard to overcome a bad strategy, and they had a bad strategy. I think what they should have done is they should have put all the eggs in Howe's basket. I think if had they taken, Burgoyne's army, moved them by sea because they had total control of the sea, moved them by sea, linked up with Burgoyne or Howe rather, and Howe would now have this big immense army. I think he may have been able to you never know. He may have been able to run down Washington and finally and defeat him, but you never know.
I think honestly, I think even if the British were able to militarily defeat them, I think the war was unwinnable because you already have this American identity that they have formed for themselves and these ideals that they've created for themselves, and you have this island 3,000 miles away trying to control that. Even if they had been militarily defeated, it just would have been a headache to still manage, and I think independence would have been won eventually anyway.
Yeah, you might be right about that. I just think militarily, their best chance
Yeah,
was
was
Howe's
how
strategy, but
probably you're
even
probably
then,
right.
that may have been too little, too late.